Okay, for some reason I accidentally shut off the recording about 10 minutes into it. I have no idea how I did it. So I got to record this class. So you're being recorded, so act busy. Would you like some homework? No. Would you like some homework? Yeah. Okay, I can't give you the bookmark till tomorrow, but I'd like you to read 631 to 636, so finish chapter 14, and then start chapter 50, basically up until, I think we're at to Gettysburg. 639 to 675 on Thursday. 675. 639 to 675.
For what?
Thursday. For Thursday. And I might, well, we'll see. We have a quiz on Thursday or Friday on that, but we have to talk about DBQ. And if everything goes right, I want the DBQ on Friday.
That's an essay.
Yeah, it's an essay. It's a 5-paragraph essay. And I gave you some material. Please go through it. So on Wednesday or Thursday, I will give you the documents in advance. So you come in, you can be prepared to write. I want good DBQs, but it will count as a test. And you have to have outside information. If you just summarize the documents, that's the sure way to a C or D, which I know you won't do, right? You want outside information to relate documents to facts. I repeat, you want to relate documents to facts that you know. Did you catch what I said? It's not summarizing documents, it's relating documents to stuff you know so you can use it as evidence in your essay. What's that evidence gets you in court? The evidence in the essay. And now Turner, what was the slave rebellion or the suspected slave rebellion in South Carolina? That could have been a 7. Someone said it, I think. Yeah, Denmark, Fifties. And what was the most common form of slave resistance? You passive resistance, and then turn around and do what? What? And then what's? And then say it again. Well, there's got to be more than just that. Even though that could be one method of, what do we call that? Yeah, it's sabotage. So you and why were there so few slave rebellions in the United States? Not because they're so bloody, but also the other big reasons. Yeah, there's just more whites. So it didn't make sense, especially when slavery was based more and more on color. And poor whites didn't have much, but they were not going to allow slave rebellion because that might get rid of what little they had. I left this up and baffled my study hall. I had no idea why I had that up. So yesterday I'm thinking about political scandals or myths in American history. So that was Warren G. Harding's mini myths. Warren G. Harding had many scandals. So, what methods? This is what I gave you yesterday at the bell, right? Yeah. So, what I'd like you to do is this. Even though I know, I do want you to still write down that thesis. Some of you did write down that thesis statement. But, if you, those who wrote it down, please type it in on Teams or let me take a look at it, and I will let you know if you wrote a good thesis. Sound good? Some of you I didn't look at, but I do want to look at them. Don't forget, you need a good a why to tie everything together, and then these are your topics. Something to tie it all together. So just to remind you, please, the next day, if you send in the Teams, I'll make a quick comment if it's good or bad or the other. So let's get to abolitionism. Abolitionists, this was the belief that slavery was immoral. It could have been that it was it's repressive to everybody. It is immoral to enslave other human beings. There's lots of reasons why they viewed slavery as immoral. And their goals are going to be really all over the place. Before I get to the two most important abolitionists weren't necessarily what you might think. It wasn't we should get rid of slavery because I believe in equality of all men. In fact, these three basic elements were big questions in an abolitionist. Most abolitionists would not have believed that slaves should be freed and then become equal citizens of the United States. a lot of them believed that the United States should be a white republic. And therefore, slaves, if freed, should not be allowed to live here. And lastly, remember, free soil was the idea that there's no slavery in the territories. Yeah, abolitionists were free soilers. You didn't want slavery in the territories, but most free soilers were not abolitionists. They might not have liked slavery. They didn't want slavery to spread to something like the Mexican Cession, but they were not ready to remove slavery in South Carolina. And so free soilers were not the same. But Southerners believed free soilers were just abolitionists in disguise. And all abolitionists, therefore all free soilers, are all John Browns. So, abolitionists did not believe in equality. And maybe 5 to 8% of the North by 1860 were abolitionists. It was a small percentage of the North, let alone none in the South. If you're an abolitionist in the South, you won't last long. They were a violent, repressive crew in the South. The two most famous abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison, in 1831 would write his abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator. Now, he did believe in equality and wanted to end slavery now. And he was actually pretty divisive amongst abolitionists. But 1831 is a key year. It came out just months before Nat Turner's rebellion. And Southerners would blame Garrison for that rebellion. That's why they censored the mail in the Nat Turner laws. That's why they put the gag rule in. They said slaves would have been perfectly happy if not for agitators like Garrison. But the most famous abolitionist was a former slave, Trevor Douglas. He escaped slavery in Maryland. He was a household slave, sold, horribly mistreated, like even more mistreated than normal, ran away to the North, would buy his own freedom from fees he would get by giving abolitionist speeches. Very foresighted, and like Garrison, believed that equality between not only between the races, but he was at Seneca Falls. He was at Seneca Falls. Remember Seneca Falls, the Women's Rights Convention? And his newspaper he would start would be called, I love the imagery, the North Star. The North Star. Trust me, if you have the North Star south of the Mason-Dixon line, right here, you're dead. That's the society the South had. And I love the imagery though, don't you? A runaway slave, how do you know if you're getting to freedom? Follow the North Star. I love that imagery. And he believed not just in freedom, equality. Equality for all. And he looked at it differently than a lot of abolitionists, who looked at the cruelty of the system of slavery and saw beyond just the fact that there were some people enslaved and some people free. He understood how the class structure kept so many poor whites in a system of horrible poverty, but divided from slaves because they have color of skin. And he understood where racism came from. It was class. It goes back to Bacon's rebellion, and the very wealthy wanted to make sure that they could keep the system of slavery to keep themselves in power. And poor whites didn't have much, but they would fight against freeing slaves and inequality to keep what little status they had. And the idea, and he really tried, and ultimately in his lifetime failed, and maybe still to this day, try to unify basically working people regardless of class. He went that kind of this Bacon's rebellion attitude. He would be bitterly. Well, I jumped the gun here. During the Civil War, one of his big goals was to have black soldiers fight for the United States. How could you not say that they're not equal citizens if they fight for the United States. And when black soldiers would fight, that would be decisive for the victory of the United States. They wouldn't have won without that. There'd be no United States. And then they'd be so disappointed after the initial promise of Reconstruction, promising equality in a multiracial democracy, and that would be dashed by 1880, which we will come to. So that's Trevor Douglas. But to give you an idea of the contradictions within abolitionists, we must talk about one group called the American Colonization Society. And these were abolitionists opposed to slavery, but they wanted a white republic. And their thought was they should work to free slaves, so maybe raise money, keep a desk, and then buy their freedom. And then send them to Africa. And the idea was back to Africa, back to their home. And this is the currency of this place they would create in Africa. The capital of this place would be called Monrovia, after President Monroe. And the irony of this, and also shows the insanity of this, most slaves have no idea what part of Africa they came from, and almost all slaves in the United States by the 1820s were born in what country? They're in the United States, just like everybody else in the United States. And so, this is kind of ridiculous. They went back and they basically colonized a hunk of Africa. And those on top would be the former slaves, and the Africans would be on the bottom. Which is weird contradiction. And what country would they create? Still there. Say it again. Yeah, that's Liberia. I heard someone say it. Yep. Liberia. Liberia. Liberia is still a country. Originally, it was going to be all on the coast. They kind of bought complex where they bought from a couple of tribes there. You guys are going to call part of it Maryland, but that would eventually go away and become the Ivory Coast. But Liberia is still there. And this class difference between the former slaves and the Africans who were there would grew for a long time. Basically, the former slaves ran that's kind of this little elite group that ran the country, and they're going to have horrific civil war. A horrific civil war all through the 1990s. A bloody hell. Well into the 2000s. And it'd be known for unbelievable cruelty. One of the best things it would be known for, worse things, I guess, is what I mean to say, would be child soldiers. They'd recruit 8, 9 years old, hook them on amphetamines, and they would murder each other. Horrific tortures. And so the legacy of Liberia didn't quite happen the way they thought. But by 1900, every country in Africa would be colonized by European powers except for two. The weird kind of hybrid Liberia. Anybody know the other country? Ethiopia. Yeah, Italy tried, but they were defeated. So, we're jumping into the fiery 50s. The events, the road to war. And you notice I put it in red? Fire. Fire. Glad you noticed the tiger. I didn't see the poor tiger fell.
Well,
But it must have fell then. Jen, put it back up there. The tiger's supposed to hang by their tails. That's how tigers get, they move around. They swing from tree to tree by their tail. That's John Brown. So let's get to what happened. Just a review. Remember the Mexican Cession? 1848. All of a sudden, California wanted to come in. And remember, what happened to California would lead to them wanting to become a state? Yeah, the old gold rush. And they wanted to be free. Because don't forget, the Mexican Cession, they didn't have slave codes. Nobody brought slaves in because they didn't have slave codes. So they want to come in as free. And that is where we left off and talked about slavery. By the way, this is all still technically Texas, which came in 1845. And I should add, the Texas Republic has a lot of debt to repay. There's all these things happening, but the big issue is slavery in the territories. Who's president? Who was elected in 1848, so became president in 1849? Oh, rough and ready? Old Zachary Taylor. Only give control to people you trust. Right? That's probably pretty good advice. Well, there's Taylor. Taylor didn't know exactly what he wanted. He was a slaveholder who distrusted democracy and the expansion of slave territory, but still, we don't know. He ironically would befriend the same guy, an abolitionist Whig, who was beaten on the floor of Congress. Remember Charles Sumner, which you read about? They befriended each other 8 years before. Kind of a weird northern and southern Whig at this time. And this is what we have. Why can't I get rid of that? There, got rid of it. Here is the problem as Taylor solved. So Taylor didn't really think about it before. He said, what's the problem? Slavery in the territories. The federal government sets up slavery free in the territories, and that's what everybody's fighting about. That's what we nearly went to civil war in 1820. The whole thing about the tariff was about this. All the fighting over Wilmot Proviso. Slavery in the territories. Slavery here. So let's just skip that step. If territories are the problem, let's just go to states. We'll create 2 states. No territory, just states. They'll be, therefore, relatively independent. Problem solved. No civil war. Everybody will hug and make up. The problem solved. And this is him straddling the north and the south as this weird kind of top of a scale. I know it's kind of awkward looking, but just go with it. And here's the thing. They would come in as states with their existing laws. Meaning California and, let me show you this state, New Mexico. A massive New Mexico. All the area in orange was his proposal for New Mexico. And their existing laws mean, will they be slave or free? They're free. So he proposed 2 free states. 2 massive free states. And don't forget, because of the Missouri Compromise, all this, no slave codes, and nobody thought Oregon is going to have slave codes. So that's it. No slavery. He thought problem solved. And he was the type of guy, once he made up his mind, he stuck to it. He had kind of like an epiphany. Like, I've solved the problem and everybody who disagrees is wrong. He really thought this will solve it. And you can imagine southern states were like, that's a great idea. Let's move on. What did southern congressmen immediately threaten? To blow the whole thing up. A new group of younger congressmen were in office, dubbed the Fire Eaters. And they wanted no compromise. Edmund Ruffin was a congressman from Virginia, and he would later claim and take credit for firing the first shot of the Civil War. Yancey of Alabama believed slavery must be spread to everywhere, including other areas we might get. Cuba, Guatemala, Argentina, and Mason of Virginia. He had to start with the Nat Turner Rebellion. They're uncompromising. Unlike the previous group of senators who are now getting near the end, these men believed if we don't get exactly what we want, not some compromise, we want to open all of this to slavery, or we'll blow the whole country up. They're the definition of bulls. They're the type of the people who would start bringing knives and guns to the floor of the United States Congress. That was the attitude of the South. And don't forget, bullies, it all starts from being scared. So those are the Fire Eaters. And they said war. And what was Taylor's response? Fine. He tried to be Andrew Jackson. I will lead the army then and crush you. It looks like war. It looks like it's going to, by the spring of 1850, it's all going to blow up. And that is when, one more time, into the breach, Henry Clay. And he would propose and put a big star by it as a group of laws that would become soon dubbed the Compromise of 1850. He wasn't just going to solve the Mexican cession problem. He's going to solve the whole thing. Now, this will be called, kind of as an attack, but the Omnibus Bill. An omnibus is one of those weird words that really only is used in Congress to this day, and it just means big bill encompassing everything. Like if Congress ever does pass a budget for all the different branches of government, they'll call it the Omnibus Budget Bill. They still do that today. It just means big bill. And he thought one big bill, everybody will compromise, will solve the problems. He was known as a great compromiser. He's best known for breaking up the bills for the Missouri Compromise. He's getting elderly. He's sick. And he knows this might be his last chance. This will be his legacy, saving the country. He won't be president, and he's kind of accepted it. I'll save the country, my legacy. By the way, that's a picture of him in 1849. He always had that look, that little grin. He knows something. So what is the Compromise of 1850? It has 5 parts. Now the second part, don't write down yet. The first 4 we will write down. So let's start with number 1, California free. He knew Southerners would not like this. Do not write, leave 2 blank for now. He proposed no slavery in D.C. So leave this one blank for now. No slavery. He knew Southerners would go nuts, but a lot of Northerners were saying, even if they're free soilers, how can we have slavery in the shadow of the United States Capitol, a country based on the idea of all men created equal? But then to appease the South, 2 biggies, New Mexico and Utah territory. So they cut New Mexico in half, Utah and New Mexico, popular sovereignty. But if they allow the vote down the road, that will open both to slavery. So there's a chance this will open to slavery, which is what Southerners want. If they have the vote now, immediately, no slavery. And then a biggie. The relative success of the Underground Railroad. They wanted slaves to be returned. Therefore, a tough fugitive slave law to force northern states to return runaways. And every citizen, meaning male citizen, must join in hunting down runaway slaves. Meaning all the men in this room would have to join. And if you were opposed to slavery and said you won't do it, you would be arrested, fined, and potentially jailed. If you did not want to run down a runaway slave. Remember what I told you. Slavery represses everyone's freedom. And then the last one, kind of controversial. Texas would have to give up some of Texas, but they'd pay back its debts. So it would be absolved of its debt when it was a republic, all those bonds it owed. Now, Henry Clay said, only where my hand is will be Texas, which infuriated Texas. But that's the original compromise. One big bill. And the thought was if everybody would give up something and this passes, the country will be saved. The country will be saved. Henry Clay's legacy, the Union is saved. The problem is, I think you might notice something here. There might be a lot for sections to like, but there's even more for sections to hate. The South was infuriated about this. The North was infuriated about this. It didn't pass. It wouldn't pass. Free soilers would not vote for it. The fire eaters won't vote for it. Here's Henry Clay proposing it. Here's the fight in the Senate, and you'll notice something. Pulling out the guns. There were fistfights on the floor of the United States House and the Senate. Usually Southerners sort of flashing knives to stop debate as bullies, threatening the death of Northerners. It's weird to say that's happening now. because that's coming. Henry Clay would go home that summer thinking he has failed. Henry Clay went home thinking it's over. The Union's done. And he knew he didn't have long. Within a year, what's that? That's his death mask. So it's really common before photography to do a plaster mask of someone's face so you remember what they look like. Because it's shocking how fast you forget things that way, no matter how hard you want to remember. So they would do a plaster cast. So after he died, that's the death mask of Henry Clay. Even though they had photography by then, that tradition had remained. And you notice he still has that grin? Henry Clay's gone. And the point is, all those senators who had flaws, they're dying. And they're being replaced, especially in the South, by absolute radicals willing to destroy the country. Willing to do it. By the way, how do you negotiate with somebody willing to blow everything up? How do you have a conversation with them? If they hate the country so much, they would rather blow it up than to compromise on it. Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, the Whig, who fought against the nullification, he came out and supported this bill and gave what his greatest speech, even though he too was faltering. Where he came in, well, you can read it, but the whole idea was we can no longer think about just our state or our section. We must come together as Americans and pass this compromise where the country's over. We must compromise. A lot of his Whig allies would be furious at him. I should add, he does kind of look like an angry owl, doesn't he? Because he too is nearing the end. Within a year, he too would die. And then a man, he was so ill with perhaps tuberculosis, he had to be carried in on a stretcher, and the stretcher was propped up, and his speech was actually read by Mason of Virginia. He was so ill. Who was that guy? John C. Calhoun. And he would propose, we can't pass the compromise. The North is too vile and too evil. We need a new constitutional amendment with 2 presidents. Each president with a veto. Meaning nothing that might hurt the South could ever be passed. Or another way to look at it, what would ever be passed through Congress? Nothing. The only way to save the Union, and that was Calhoun's proposal. Don't pass it, and it's not going to pass. But in this warped way, he wanted to save the country with slavery because he too. Oh, I got this. We do have some motion picture footage of Calhoun. Isn't that awesome? Isn't that creepy? He too would die. Oh, you want to see it? All right, before you go, wait for it. Imagine a dark, rainy night. Lightning's crack. You wake up with a start and look up and you see that face. All right. So tomorrow, we'll finish it. We're going to go. Things happen fast.
I think you need to get a mask of your face to be done.